The weight of the eagle's wings was not measured in ounces of feather or pounds of metal. It was a burden felt deep within the marrow, an invisible load pressed upon the soul by the sheer size and relentless expectations of empire. To rule Rome meant to be the nexus point for every ambition, every fear, and every hopeful whisper that rose from the sprawling reaches of civilized life. Marcus Aurelius bore this weight with the visible mantle of authority, the polished armor, the imperial robes, the bearing that demanded submission. But underneath the bronze facade, beneath the practiced gaze of a conqueror, was a man consumed by an almost unbearable exhaustion. He looked out over the marble forums, structures built to proclaim permanence, yet everything seemed mutable, susceptible to the whim of fortune and the swift passing of human folly. The problems were not confined to the borders. They seeped into the private chambers, infecting sleep, whispering anxieties through the curtained windows of his study. The emperor was expected to be an infallible figure, unshakable, predictable in his strength, magnificent in his resolve. And so, Marcus played the part flawlessly. He issued edicts that commanded millions, sat through councils where survival depended on the careful placement of words, and faced generals whose loyalty was often as volatile as the weather itself. Yet, every triumph felt tainted by the shadow of the next inevitable crisis. This relentless public performance began to erode the fragile architecture of his inner peace. The constant vigilance required of him, the need always to be prepared for betrayal, always to calculate the cost of kindness versus the safety of caution. It was a draining tax on the spirit. He found himself trapped in a cycle, command decision after brutal decision, only to wake and repeat the agonizing calculus of governance. He craved silence, not the empty quiet of death, which held its own strange peace, but the fertile silence that allows one's own thoughts to breathe without interruption. A space where the identity of emperor could be shed like a heavy cloak, allowing for the fragile self underneath to simply exist. The true weight was not the logistics of supplying legions or managing grain shipments. It was the mental labor of constantly judging humanity, its capacity for breathtaking virtue, juxtaposed against its breathtaking selfishness. He wrestled with the knowledge that millions were living lives largely unexamined, propelled by appetites and fears, while he himself had to maintain an almost superhuman standard of reasoned response. One day, amidst the endless sprawl of maps detailing threats from distant frontiers, a profound weariness settled upon him. It was not merely physical fatigue, it was existential burnout. The machine that required his leadership felt unending, its gears grinding with relentless inertia. He realized that if he remained simply reacting to the demands placed upon him, the reports, the petitions, the impending skirmishes, he would eventually cease to be himself. He risked becoming a function of the state rather than an active participant in human life. It was this realization that formed the first painful crack in the imperial edifice. The massive stage of Rome had demanded too much authenticity. He needed to find a quieter corner, a liminal space away from the echoing clamor of destiny, simply to remember who Marcus Aurelius was before he became the emperor. This necessary withdrawal would mark the beginning of his most crucial campaign, the conquest of his own mind. The weight of the eagle's wings had been a burden too heavy for one man to bear alone. The noise of the forum, the clamor of the legionaries, the endless stream of petitioners, all these sounds combined into a vast, deafening symphony of expectation. Marcus understood that ruling was not merely governing. It was performing an act of constant will, day after unrelenting day. He felt perpetually frayed, stretched thin by the gap between who he was and who the world expected him to be. To step out of his personal self and become a symbol, that was its own exhaustion. The great halls of power, designed for glory and spectacle, began to feel like gilded cages. Every decision carried the weight of Rome's destiny. Every word uttered could spark rebellion or solidify peace across vast borders. This magnitude demanded not just skill, but an unnatural resilience, a perfect equilibrium he struggled daily to maintain. He was tired, profoundly so, not just in his muscles, but deep within the core of his being. His withdrawal, therefore, was not an act of escape, nor a surrender of duty. It was, rather, a desperate internal pilgrimage. The court was full of mirrors, reflecting back only versions of him that were strong, unblemished, and perpetually successful. He needed silence to hear the voice that was genuinely his own. The magnificent city of Rome, with all its ambition, suddenly seemed too loud, too demanding. The noise did not just come from men shouting decrees, it came from their desires, the grasping, competitive whispers of status, wealth, and fear. To find peace, he had to retreat from these currents. He needed a space that was merely his own. The constant pressure to be infallible created a subtle form of paralysis. One wrong choice, one moment of weakness, could unravel years of effort and sacrifice. This terror of imperfection haunted the periphery of his thoughts. If greatness demanded flawless execution, then true rest seemed like an impossibility for a man of his stature. He wandered these marble corridors, carrying not just the robes of an emperor, but the crushing weight of every single failure that had occurred before him or might occur after. It was in this realization that he could not solve everything with policy or decree, that the need for inner solitude became paramount. The public life was a performance designed to keep Rome stable. His private life needed to be an act of reconstruction, piece by philosophical piece. He sought out the quiet places, the overlooked libraries, the empty courtyard gardens, the moments just before dawn when the city seemed to hold its breath. It was into this very core necessity that he found himself drawn. No longer did he view his private study as merely a chamber for statecraft. It transformed into an inner sanctuary. Surrounded by scrolls, yes, and maps detailing conquests and boundaries, these objects represented not just the sprawling reach of the empire, but also the endless landscape of his own mind. The emperor's quiet corner became a crucible. It was here, amid the scent of aged papyrus and dust motes dancing in shafts of weak sunlight, that he began his painful, necessary descent into self-examination. The exhaustion of ruling Rome was physical. The intellectual fatigue that consumed him now felt far deeper, rooted in the very fabric of existence itself. He questioned not just how to govern men, but how to govern himself. He realized that much of his immense struggle came from conflating his identity with his role. Marcus Aurelius was not defined by the title on his tunic. He was a thinker, a soul, a being navigating the brutal, illogical patterns of human nature and fate. To begin to separate these two things, the man from the mask, was the first act of true rebellion against destiny itself. The transition away from the clamor meant confronting what lay within the deepest recesses of his own psyche. The steady rhythm of bureaucratic life was replaced by the uncomfortable, sporadic silence of contemplation. In this quiet corner, far removed from the demanding gaze of the Senate or the watchful eyes of the Praetorian Guard, he found a terrifying freedom. This freedom demanded nothing of him but honest introspection. It required that he look inward and acknowledge the turmoil that usually remained hidden beneath layers of imperial stoicism. The scholarly tools before him, the meticulously ordered scrolls and maps, stopped being mere instruments of statecraft. They became diagrams for his soul. The routes across Germania, the borders traced in ink, began to reflect the internal boundaries he needed to establish between himself and the chaos surrounding him. He was charting a new empire, the fortress within his mind. This quiet corner, then, became less about finding answers and more about accepting the profound necessity of the question itself. It was where the magnificent weight of the world finally lifted enough for him to feel only the singular burden of being perfectly human. The weight of the imperial purple had become unbearable. To rule was to carry not just an empire, but an endless stream of human turmoil, the fever of ambition, the sharp sting of betrayal, the dull ache of constant uncertainty. Before him lay a life defined by public spectacle and immediate crisis, a grand performance for millions whose indifference he could neither understand nor change. But as he retreated into the hush of his private chambers, away from the clamor of Senate decrees and military reports, a deeper exhaustion settled over him. The initial fatigue had been physical, long nights spent poring over maps, making judgments that affected countless lives. Yet, it was a spiritual drain that finally brought him to this point, the crippling weight of accountability. Every decision required the impossible promise, perfection. He felt trapped by the expectation that he must be infallible, a living monument of virtue and military might. This pressure did not merely tire him, it began to warp his sense of self. He realized with painful clarity that the man who lived within these walls was becoming indistinguishable from the role itself. The emperor's will had started to overwrite Marcus Aurelius's inner life, smothering quiet thought beneath layers of necessary statecraft. He needed to dismantle this identity piece by piece, to find a place where he was merely Marcus, and not the divine reflection of Rome. This profound need for distance led him inevitably back to the moments that shadowed his mind. Memories of choices made in haste, strategies flawed in execution, battles lost against overwhelming odds. The present demanded strength, but his inner landscape was littered with echoes, the reverberations of past failures. These were not merely historical facts, they felt like personal accusations, whispering doubts into the quiet air. He questioned the very nature of greatness. Did true power require a continuous sacrifice of self? Was the steady suppression of doubt, emotion, and private desire the only acceptable currency for maintaining an empire? He looked at these ghosts of error, a commander who faltered, a diplomat who misjudged a mood, a general whose armies stalled at a vital crossing, and found no comfort in their stories. The narrative constantly whispered that weakness was intolerable, that every emotional ripple, every moment of hesitation or fear, represented not just personal failing, but a potential catastrophe for the state. This expectation created an internal tyrant far more demanding than any barbarian army. It demanded a ruthless pruning of emotion and complexity simply to sustain the appearance of control. To face these echoes was to confront a mirror that reflected inadequacy. Each memory became a point of painful scrutiny, highlighting moments when he had acted out of pride, fear, or even misplaced compassion, emotions which, in the rigid machinery of empire, were treated as liabilities. The weight felt tremendous, suggesting that the path to legitimacy required not just virtue, but emotional amputation. He began to suspect that perhaps the pursuit of absolute strength meant discarding the messy, unpredictable richness of humanity itself. The accumulated failures, both monumental public setbacks and small, private lapses of judgment, formed a relentless chorus around him. They told him he was fundamentally insufficient for the divine mantle placed upon his shoulders. If all those prior struggles, all those moments where human frailty showed itself, defined him, then perhaps Marcus Aurelius truly did not exist outside the shadow of potential regret. This forced reflection became less about reviewing events and more about understanding a fundamental error in his internal operating system, confusing experience with identity. He was treating mistakes as defining character traits rather than temporary moments that could inform future action. It required an immense, almost painful cognitive shift to accept that failure was not the antithesis of worthiness. It was, perhaps, its necessary precursor. The constant comparison between the idealized image of the philosopher-emperor and the actual, conflicted man proved nearly unbearable. The world expected stoic indifference, while his own heart still possessed a deep, messy capacity for grief, hope, and even irrational affection. These natural human instincts were viewed by the machine of state as dangerous inefficiencies. He understood, then, that simply surviving the crises was insufficient. He needed to change how he related to those crises in retrospect. The accumulated echoes of failure could not serve as chains that bound him to past inadequacy. They had to become mere data points, lessons absorbed, catalogued, and neutralized before they could poison his present resolve. This deep self-examination was grueling work. It demanded more endurance than any march through the frontier wars. He was engaged in a war not against enemies of Rome, but against the powerful, convincing narrative of his own imperfection. To proceed meant accepting that greatness would never be defined by flawless execution, but by the integrity with which he processed error. The weight of the empire was a physical thing. It pressed down on his shoulders, heavier than any armor. To rule meant to constantly calculate risk, weigh potential outcomes against immediate necessity, and predict not just human actions, but the shifting currents of history itself. Marcus had come to understand that command demanded an exhausting level of certainty, yet life offered only shades of doubt. He yearned for a silence that was not merely the absence of noise, but the absence of expectation, the release from being perpetually required to be flawless. In his private study, far removed from the clamor of senatorial ambition or the clash of legionnaires' shields, he sought refuge in introspection. This room became less a physical location and more an echoing chamber for his own troubled mind. He was physically weary, but the deepest fatigue came from the constant performance of being the emperor. It required a magnificent charade, one that demanded him to mute his personal doubts at all costs. The deeper he ventured into himself, the clearer the resistance became. The peace he sought was not easily granted. It had to be clawed back from the corners of his own anxieties. He began an unwelcome acquaintance, the inner critic. It sounded like the echo of every doubt cast upon him, amplified and made terribly personal. This voice was insidious, a constant murmur whispering that the gap between who he was and who Rome demanded him to be was too wide to bridge. It told him that his exhaustion was weakness, that his contemplation was dangerous inaction. It haunted him with specters of past mistakes. The battles fought poorly, the judgments rendered swiftly, the words spoken in anger when restraint was the highest virtue. These weren't merely memories. They felt like living accusations, sharp little critiques constantly reminding him that he had fallen short of some mythical standard of perfect leadership. He wrestled with these ghosts of imperfection. If true greatness meant continuous struggle and the total suppression of all natural human feeling, fear, fatigue, momentary doubt, then what was left for mere men? He began to see a pattern in his internal torment. He equated emotional control with self-worth, believing that any lapse into personal vulnerability would instantly dismantle his credibility as ruler. The inner critic prospered on this very equation. It fed off the idea that humanity and duty were mutually exclusive. When he felt tired, the voice hissed, "You are unfit to govern." When a decision was uncertain, it warned, "You lack the necessary steel." The pressure mounted until introspection itself felt like an act of betrayal against his duties. This constant self-interrogation became a relentless trial by fire. Marcus realized that he had spent years building a persona, the steadfast, infallible emperor, a monumental structure sustained entirely by external expectation and internal denial. This required him to view his own emotional life as a set of weaknesses that needed militaristic suppression. But the Stoic path demanded something more radical than mere suppression. It required understanding. He could not simply silence this critical voice. He had to argue with it, to analyze its premises, and ultimately diminish its power through sheer philosophical rigor. He started examining the accusations one by one. The critic accused him of hesitation in times of crisis. Marcus responded by asking, "What is truly catastrophic, the pause before action, or acting purely out of raw, unexamined emotion?" He began to distinguish between genuine human frailty, the temporary fatigue that every body must endure, and fundamental character flaws. To be tired was not the same as being unworthy. The sheer force of maintaining this dichotomy was overwhelming. He felt caught in a philosophical trap. If he accepted his own imperfection, would he lose the respect needed to lead? If he denied his flaws for the sake of command, would he sacrifice his soul? The inner critic seemed to laugh at him from the vaulted ceilings of his mind, reminding him that only men carved entirely from granite could bear the weight of the eagle's wings. The most painful lesson was learning to detach the value of the self from the record of errors. His past mistakes were not defining markers of who he was, but merely data points, lessons stored for future use. He started treating them not as failures, which implied a character defect, but as mere events that had occurred. They happened, they taught, and therefore they held no ultimate power over his self-definition. This internal combat was exhausting because it required him to simultaneously maintain the disciplined facade of the emperor while undertaking the messy, volatile work of psychological deconstruction. It was a battle fought not with swords and shields on foreign soil, but within the quiet chambers of one's own understanding. He learned that strength did not reside in avoiding mistakes, but in how rapidly and thoroughly one could admit them, learn from them, and then integrate that painful knowledge without letting it poison the core of their character. This was the beginning of the difficult work, accepting the whole, flawed human being beneath the mantle of imperial greatness. His journey was shifting from merely ruling Rome to first mastering the self within himself. The weight of the empire and the tumult within the self had become a familiar ache. He had spent so long grappling with the demands of public life, fighting against the corrosive anxieties that threatened to dismantle his sense of self. Now, far from the marble halls and the endless stream of petitions, he sought out the wild places where human ambition seemed small and inconsequential. He found himself by a riverbank, watching the constant flow of water, a perfect metaphor for life itself. It never paused, yet it moved with an undeniable pattern. This current represented time, relentless and indifferent to man's struggles or triumphs. He watched a fallen branch tumble into the deep, disappearing quickly below the surface, only to be replaced moments later by a fresh twig swept downstream. The river taught him the first great lesson of acceptance. Nothing lasts, and nothing is truly new. This ceaseless cycle was nature's steady rhythm, utterly unaffected by his imperial sorrows or his personal doubts. The seasons shifted with the same quiet certainty, winter giving way to spring, decay nurturing rebirth. These processes were not exceptions, but the fundamental law of existence. If he could accept that everything must change, that every empire will fade, every person will pass away, and even this quiet moment would eventually break into memory, then perhaps the grip of permanence on his own emotions might loosen. The resistance to impermanence was, in itself, a source of immense suffering. He spent hours observing these cycles, the gradual erosion of rock by the current, the seed tucked into earth awaiting its inevitable emergence. Every ending contained within it the promise of beginning. The natural world offered him an impartial judgment, free from the politics and expectations that plagued Rome. It simply was. It did not judge a weak reign or praise a great military victory. It merely flowed, endured, and regenerated. By observing this profound indifference, he began to understand resilience differently. It was not about overcoming fate with sheer force of will. It was about accepting the flow of life and meeting change with tranquility. The intellectual struggle continued where the river ended. His meditations were no longer simply reactions against his inner critic, but philosophical observations modeled after nature itself. He began writing to himself that true strength lay in aligning the human spirit not against reality, but with it. This acceptance was not passive resignation. Rather, it was an active embrace of what is unavoidable. He realized that much of the distress he carried, the fear of failure, the longing for eternal glory, the attachment to specific outcomes, was based on faulty premises drawn from human desire. These desires were unnatural and disruptive. The river did not mourn the fallen branch. It simply incorporated its matter into its endless journey. Neither should his spirit do. This contemplation deepened his empathy. If the forest accepts the annual cycle of burning and regrowth, why must he treat every disagreement or setback with such personal distress? He began to view human suffering not as a moral failure, but as an inevitable part of existence, like drought or flood. His job, therefore, was not to prevent the challenges, for that was impossible, but to maintain his inner composure regardless of what life threw at him. The weight of external events shifted from being a source of personal crisis to becoming merely raw material, data points in the grand experiment of existence. He understood that struggle and ease, pain and joy, were simply two sides of the same natural process. To resist them was exhausting. To flow with them required wisdom and disciplined acceptance. The lesson of nature's cycle provided the framework for everything he had learned until now. That stability is found not in unchanging circumstances, but in an unshakable inner agreement with reality. By accepting transience, he finally began to shed the burdens of expectation, his own, and those placed upon him by Rome. We have journeyed far from the roar of the forum and the clamor of military decision. In those times, we learned that exhaustion is not merely a lack of sleep, but a profound fatigue of the soul, worn down by trying to perform perfection. We were taught to wear the mask of the flawless leader, always knowing the perfect answer, never showing doubt. But the weight of expectation, whether it came from senators, soldiers, or even our own internalized judgment, became unbearable. We spent time confronting our past failures, those echoes that seemed to define us. We learned that mistakes are not wounds upon the soul. They are simply data points, evidence of an imperfect human striving for excellence. But this healing journey demands more than just acknowledging what went wrong. It requires us to dismantle the very foundations upon which we built our self-criticism. The critic, as powerful as it is cruel, speaks a deceptive language. It whispers, "You should be stronger. You should never falter. You must always anticipate every disaster before it happens." And these shoulds become invisible chains. They restrict the breath of spontaneity and anchor the spirit to an impossible ideal. The great philosophical task now becomes recognizing these shoulds. Where do they originate? Are they truths carved from universal law, like gravity, or are they merely the fragile constructions built by other people's expectations? Consider the expectation of the statesman. You should know best. You must always command certainty. But is genuine wisdom not found in accepting the shades of gray, the places where clarity fractures? When we accept this premise, the need for absolute control begins to loosen its grip. The burden placed upon us by society, the endless cycle of political maneuverings, military campaigns, and domestic needs, creates a collective fiction. That life must be lived as an optimal performance. We are constantly told how we should feel in certain situations, what decisions we ought to prioritize, and who we should become simply because of our title or station. The true weight, however, is not the empire itself. It is the sheer accumulation of assumed duties. The should dictates a life lived by external measurement, measuring virtue against gold standards, measuring resilience against military success stories. This leads to a perpetual state of inadequacy and anxiety. To deconstruct these internalized demands is an act of radical self-permission. It means pausing the internal debate and asking, who spoke that rule? When did I first accept that this should was unbreakable law? Was it my own fear or the fleeting judgment of a crowd? It requires us to distinguish between responsibility and mandate. Responsibility is the choice we make from a place of genuine commitment. It acknowledges complexity. A mandate is an external decree, a demand for conformity based on flawed assumptions about human nature. The philosopher's first act, therefore, must be to become skeptical of assumed necessity. We must test every internal dictate that begins with I should or one ought. When we strip these prefixes away, what remains? What is the fundamental requirement for a soul merely striving to live well? We realize that living authentically does not mean rejecting duty entirely. Rather, it means rooting our duties in virtue itself, not in fear of consequence. It demands an internal calculus. Am I acting because it is morally right, or because failing to act feels like violating a self-imposed social contract? The distinction changes everything. This intellectual clearing is exhausting work. It requires us to untangle ourselves from the narrative woven by others and weave anew a story defined only by our own reasoned commitment to goodness. We must grant ourselves the grace of being human, to be capable of doubt, capable of error, and therefore capable of immense growth. The perfection demanded by the world is a gilded cage. Self-acceptance is the open sky. The goal of this deconstruction is not to abandon principle, but to refine it, to build principles that stand on solid ground. Truth, reason, and compassion for the messy, imperfect reality of being alive. Only when we cease trying to live up to an external ledger of shoulds can we find the genuine freedom to serve justly, to govern thoughtfully, and finally, to simply exist in peace within the vast theater of our own lives. Having walked through the labyrinth of expectation and the shifting sands of nature's inevitable flow, Marcus found himself at a precipice of understanding. He had learned to accept what was beyond his control, recognizing that resistance only fueled suffering. Yet, true peace demanded more than mere acceptance. It required an internal preparation for loss itself. This brings him to the practice known as negative visualization. It is not morbid contemplation, but rather a rigorous intellectual exercise in anticipating adversity. Marcus begins by systematically emptying his mind of what he currently considers essential: the power of the empire, the comfort of his routine, even the warmth of human connection. He imagines the loss of the legions, their discipline scattered to dust by time and conflict. He envisions the marble halls of Rome crumbling into mere rubble, swallowed by the relentless caress of seasons and neglect. At first, the visions are jarring. They evoke a sharp pang of grief, a visceral attachment to what is solid, permanent, and glorious. The mind recoils, clinging desperately to the present moment as if its existence guarantees its permanence. This emotional pull represents man's natural desire for stability, the deep-seated human fear of the unknown terminus. But Marcus resists this gravitational pull. He treats these imagined losses not as prophecies of doom, but as philosophical hypotheticals. By rehearsing suffering in the safety of his own mind, he strips the future threat of its power to shock or destabilize him. If he has already mentally inhabited the reality of defeat, the stripping away of titles, wealth, and reputation, then when actual misfortune strikes, it arrives not as a terrifying shock, but as a predictable consequence. The brilliance of this exercise lies in its indifference to outcome. He learns that his happiness, his fundamental self-worth, is fundamentally separate from these external conditions. The empire may fall, the people he governs may turn against him, his family may scatter across distant lands. Yet, who remains? He gradually discovers a quiet center, a core consciousness that survives the imagining of total collapse. This process systematically dismantles attachment. Attachment is the root of most human suffering. We build elaborate mental edifices around things we believe must remain. Our status, our possessions, our beloved relationships. The loss of these things is not merely inconvenience. It feels like an amputation of self. Negative visualization forces him to look beyond the skin of his identity and examine the architecture beneath, the resilient structure of virtue itself. He realizes that by preparing himself for the worst conceivable scenario, a life stripped bare of all glory, all comfort, and all support, he is paradoxically fortifying his capacity for joy and gratitude in the present. The anticipated nothingness makes everything visible and valuable. He starts to see people not through the lens of their utility or their rank, but purely as fellow temporary beings walking the same brief path toward oblivion. This reframing changes how he engages with the world. When minor setbacks occur, a failed negotiation, a bureaucratic delay, a personal slight, they no longer possess the catastrophic weight they once held. They become merely small echoes in the vast timeline of history, trivial against the backdrop of life's great cycles and eventual decay. The power of negative visualization is thus revealed to be an ultimate preemptive resilience training. It is not about dwelling on sadness. It is about achieving emotional immunity through rigorous intellectual preparation. Marcus understands that by calmly embracing the possibility of total loss, he emancipates himself from the tyranny of expectation. He frees his mind to focus entirely on what truly belongs only to him, his capacity for reasoned judgment and virtuous action in this very moment. Only then does the true work begin, to live each day not as if things might last forever, but precisely because they are fleeting and precious. The preparation is complete. The soldier may now enter the fray of life with a quiet confidence, knowing that even if all arms fail, his internal citadel remains untouched. He has learned that freedom is found not in accumulating safety, but in anticipating danger and remaining whole regardless of what comes to take it away. This acceptance becomes the foundational cornerstone for every subsequent challenge. The ability to respond with reason when everything around him screams for emotional reaction. We have spent our time preparing for the moment of reckoning. We have learned that true self-mastery is not a monument we build, but a process, a continuous withdrawal from the clamor of immediate response. Until now, Marcus understood resilience through preparation. He knew what to expect in times of hardship because he had systematically practiced facing loss and challenging expectation. He walked away from his inner criticisms armed with cycles of nature and philosophical detachment. But theory remains only until it meets the raw, unpredictable friction of reality. Reality has a way of violating our carefully constructed mental protocols. It does not pause for contemplation or wait for self-mastery to achieve its peak. Crisis does not send an invitation, it simply erupts. And when the inevitable crisis arrives, a betrayal in the ranks, a sudden and shocking defeat, bad news delivered with callous speed, our deepest training is tested at the precise chasm between stimulus and reaction. Our minds are built for anticipation, for the intellectual exercise of imagined loss. But they are not naturally equipped for the instantaneous shock. The greatest difficulty lies not in managing sadness or regret. It is mastering the immediate moment, the split-second gap that exists when a devastating event occurs. That fleeting pause, which feels like eternity to the mind, is where all wisdom must be drawn. It is the crucial space between seeing and acting. Before this point, Marcus was preparing the mental scaffolding. Now, he must build the muscles to use it under duress, in full flow with an opposing force of chaos or injustice. He recognizes that his profound training has given him the map, but not necessarily the reflexes required for a life-or-death sprint against entropy. Therefore, his focus narrows entirely onto this single, critical discipline, the art of pausing. The moment something strikes us, whether it is a rumor of failure echoing from the battlefield or a personal slight delivered in polished marble halls, our first instinct is always to defend ourselves. We react immediately. The impulse is primal and protective. Anger flares, defensiveness rises like smoke, and the tongue seeks immediate rebuttal. These reactive impulses are deeply satisfying because they offer instant catharsis. We believe that by shouting our displeasure or justifying our position right away, we restore equilibrium. But in governance and in personal character, swift reaction is almost always a failure of judgment. Emotion dictates action, and emotional actions build nothing lasting but regret and mistrust. The stoic wisdom he had cultivated, the quiet acceptance of fate, the understanding that external events do not affect true virtue, requires him to conquer this initial, powerful surge of reactive energy. This requires an absolute mastery over the physical body as much as the intellectual mind. He must learn to interrupt the chain reaction in his own neural pathways. When faced with a sudden injustice or bad tidings, he is trained to take a visible breath. Not just a sigh of resignation, but a conscious, deliberate pause that physically slows the rhythm of his heart and steadies his hands. This pause functions as an impermeable shield between the raw shock of the event and the reasoned clarity of his judgment. It forces him out of his internal storytelling mode, the one where he is immediately assigning blame or constructing a narrative of victimization, and grounds him in simple, unvarnished reality. He learns to regard the stimulus itself not as an attack upon his self, but merely as data. Is this news accurate? What underlying motivations might drive this betrayal? Am I interpreting mere noise as existential threat? This detachment is agonizing because it requires denying the most immediate, powerful emotional response available to him. It means allowing anger or fear to exist in his body without permitting them to dictate the actions of his mouth or sword arm. He practices viewing difficult situations not through the lens of how this harms me, but through the detached query. What is the rational response here? This shift in focus transforms a crisis from a personal assault into an objective problem needing strategic and virtuous resolution. The ultimate goal, he realizes, is to embody what Seneca called judicious calmness. It is not simply waiting for the wave of anger to pass. It is proactively choosing a measured response before the wave has even broken upon him. This mastery is the final frontier of self-governance, the discipline of intentional delay. By cultivating this gap between stimulus and response, he moves from being governed by impulse to actively governing his will. He begins to see that true power does not lie in swift retaliation or triumphant defiance. It lies in the silent strength of restraint, the measured dignity shown when all surrounding circumstances scream for emotional outburst. It is here, standing at the precipice of immediate action versus profound pause, that Marcus finally integrates every lesson. The acceptance of change learned from nature, the humility gained from recognizing mortality, and the discipline to discard social expectation. All these foundations must coalesce into this single, powerful tool, the capacity to wait, to breathe, to observe, and only then, when the internal self is rock solid and untouched by fear or fury, does action become nothing short of virtuous necessity. This intentional delay, this profound pause, becomes his ultimate defense against the fickle chaos of empire and the unpredictable darkness of human nature. It is the defining characteristic of the truly resilient spirit. The years of command had taught Marcus that the greatest conflicts were never fought with legions or blades. They unfolded in the silent, volatile chambers of the human heart. He had learned how to navigate empires and armies, but now he stood at a crossroads where the world's boundaries seemed insignificant compared to the boundless complexities of another person's soul. This was the final frontier of his self-study, empathy across worlds. The lesson that resonated most deeply was that human beings were, fundamentally, mirrors reflecting their own prejudices back upon us. The rigid lines drawn between citizen and barbarian, general and plebeian, wealthy patrician and struggling farmer, often obscured a single unifying truth, the shared struggle for dignity. To truly rule himself meant to see beyond these superficial labels. He found himself observing those who existed on opposite sides of his world. A soldier whose loyalty was born not of grand ideals but of fear, the fear of poverty, the fear of abandonment. He saw in him not just a threat or merely a useful tool for Rome, but a man burdened by the same need for purpose that afflicted himself. Similarly, he watched the merchants and artisans of the sprawling city, whose lives were measured in coin rather than virtue. They worried over the unpredictable tides of fortune, their anxieties echoing the deep-seated worry of any creature subject to time's passage. The temptation was always toward judgment, to categorize, to dismiss, to apply the elegant certainty of Stoic philosophy to a messy reality. But he remembered his training. Life is characterized by ambiguity. Certainty belongs only to reason in its purest form, and the world outside that pristine mind is a glorious, frustrating mess. He began practicing what felt almost counterintuitive, radical acceptance without condition. He stopped judging another person's core motivations simply because it did not align with his own understanding of virtue. If someone acted out of desperation, a panicked theft, a petty quarrel fueled by envy, he sought the root cause beneath the action. Was the act driven by genuine malice or merely by a temporary failure of discipline? To assume the latter was to begin the work of compassion. Consider the soldier marching under duress. He is not acting because he suddenly understands Nicander's virtues. He is acting because his life depends on following orders, however unjust those orders might seem in retrospect. His behavior stems from a fragile network of external dependencies. To view him only through the lens of Roman law was to miss his fundamental vulnerability. He possessed an inner life as complex and worthy of respect as any senator's carefully curated intellectual pursuits. The same gentle effort unfolded when he encountered those whose worlds seemed utterly detached, the people living outside the paved roads, guided by simpler rhythms than imperial decree allowed. They embodied a different covenant with existence, one governed by nature, the seasonal shift of harvest, or the unforgiving dictates of local custom. Their wisdom was not inscribed on scrolls. It was etched into the lines around their eyes, earned through physical labor and enduring community life. The critical insight here was that all these worlds, the highly structured court, the gritty military camp, the subsistence farmstead, were governed by a single human constant: impermanence. The emperor's power fades, the legionary's strength wanes, the harvest will fail. Suffering is not an external flaw in their lives, but simply the expected friction of existence itself. This realization shattered the conceptual walls he had built around himself. He realized that if all were transient, if all human ambition and suffering shared the same fleeting nature as a sunset or a passing cloud, then judgment became intellectually sterile. To despise another's struggle was to deny the natural, universal rhythm of the cosmos itself. Empathy, therefore, was not a soft emotion. It was a rigorous philosophical discipline. It required him to dismantle his own internal narratives of superiority and understand that true virtue lay in acknowledging shared frailty. When he looked at an enemy general who stood before him, filled with bravado or bitter defiance, he no longer saw merely the opposing faction. He saw another creature, equally subject to hunger, loss, pride, and fleeting joy, a mirror image struggling under the weight of its own mortality. This was the transcendence from self-concern to universal humanity. The lesson taught by empathy across worlds was a profound recalibration of worth. Worth is not granted by title, nor earned by military victory, nor even secured by deep personal virtue alone. It is inherent, existing simply by the fact of conscious life itself. This expanded view did not diminish his own stature or responsibility. Rather, it rendered them meaningless in comparison to the totality of shared experience. He understood that compassion was not weakness. In the highest form, viewing every person, the pauper and the prince, the foe and the friend, as equally valuable components within the great mechanism of existence, became the ultimate act of disciplined strength. It transformed the battlefield into a philosophical proving ground where the greatest victory was simply seeing humanity in its broadest, most imperfect splendor. The previous journey has shown him the subtle traps of self-doubt and the seductive comfort of complaint. He has learned to separate temporary pain from fundamental weakness, understanding that most anxiety stems not from external reality, but from internal misjudgment. But even with this hard-won clarity remains one final mystery. What is freedom? Throughout his life as emperor, he believed freedom lay in mastery, the ability to command armies or to control his own immediate emotional response. He thought resilience was an act of force, a battle won against the chaos outside him. Yet now, standing at the precipice of true self-understanding, he realizes this entire understanding has been incomplete. The struggle to be resilient had always been perceived as fighting something external, fighting betrayal in court, fighting barbarian incursions at the frontier, or fighting his own overwhelming impatience. He was constantly pushing back against the tide of circumstance. But through contemplation, through observing the river that insists on flowing regardless of obstruction, and viewing the inevitable turning of seasons, he began to see a deeper truth. True freedom is not found in resistance. It is found in alignment. He remembers the voices that told him he must be everything: the invincible warrior, the flawless administrator, the perfect son of Rome. These were mandates imposed by others, by his culture, even by his own ambition. He spent years constructing mental walls to contain these expectations, solidifying a defensive self against perceived threats and judgment. But this constant state of readiness for attack was itself a form of bondage. To perpetually guard oneself is to acknowledge that danger exists, thereby giving danger authority over one's inner peace. The path forward demanded the hardest relinquishing, giving up the notion of absolute control. If freedom is not resistance, then it must be acceptance. But this cannot mean passive surrender, a life surrendered simply because things are difficult amounts to nothing more than resignation. It required an active engagement with reality, informed by perfect clarity. This was where he found the true definition of duty. Duty, for Marcus Aurelius, is not merely something one must do because they wear a specific uniform or possess a title. A dutiful action flows from recognizing what is inherently good and necessary in the natural order. It means acting according to virtue itself, irrespective of outcome, recognition, or personal desire. When he defined his actions this way, two profound things happened. First, the burden of achieving an external result vanished. His purpose was no longer to succeed, but simply to act rightly. Second, since his motivation became intrinsic, a direct function of virtue, it became immune to circumstance. The failure of a battle no longer signaled a moral failing. The betrayal of a friend did not constitute a breach of his own character. He could perform his highest duty while accepting all outcomes with dignity and grace. This understanding unlocked the definition of freedom in the imperial context. True personal liberty, therefore, was never withdrawal into a quiet study or meditation garden. It was the willingness to walk back into the center of the storm, armed not with stronger walls or sharper judgments, but with the humble recognition that his highest calling is simply to participate fully and virtuously in the flow of existence. He recognized that the most powerful form of human bondage is believing that one's identity is dependent on achieving goals, maintaining status, or avoiding pain. The moment he decoupled self-worth from external achievement, the momentary success of a campaign, the praise of the Senate, the stability of his household, he became genuinely unbound. He was free to serve. The role of emperor, with all its weight and inevitable cruelty, finally shifted from being a prison of expectations into the ultimate gymnasium for the soul. The greatest virtue, he understood, is not in avoiding difficulty, but in showing up for it anyway, recognizing that duty itself provides the framework for personal liberty. This acceptance of obligation became his deepest form of freedom, a magnificent and profound commitment to simply doing what must be done, with integrity, regardless of whether it brings glory or ignominy. The weight lifted not when he stopped caring about consequences, but precisely when he perfected the art of caring only for the virtue in the action itself. This quiet realization formed the cornerstone of his resilience, finding unshakable freedom not through escape, but through perfect immersion in one's purpose. After confronting the endless demands of external life, Marcus began to look inward, searching not for answers in scrolls or armies, but within the quiet chambers of his own mind. The realization that true peace was external to the empire he governed was profound and unsettling. If tranquility could be found anywhere else, it was here, behind the curtain of consciousness itself. His studies led him away from philosophy as a set of doctrines and toward something far more personal, self-governance. He began to think of the mind not as merely an organ of thought, but as a structure, a place that could be defended. He envisioned it as a fortress, a sanctuary built against the inevitable storms of public life. This was the concept he would call the inner citadel. It suggested that no matter how chaotic the world outside became, no matter how relentless the pressures from generals, senators, or even his own fears, the core self could remain undisturbed. The citadel was not built with stone and mortar, but with reason and acceptance. The walls were constructed by recognizing what genuinely belonged to him, and nothing external fit that definition. His emotions, judgments, opinions, these were internal properties. They could be trained, examined, and reinforced. Everything else, the outcome of a battle, the fickle mood of the crowd, the weight of his title, was merely an occurrence outside his jurisdiction. Building this mental fortress was not passive contemplation. It required active construction. Marcus had spent years recognizing that simply acknowledging external reality was insufficient. He needed to build systems of resistance against emotional chaos. He practiced disciplines of radical detachment. When faced with unjust criticism, he would mentally dismiss it as the mere shouting of a storm passing over his walls. When tragedy struck, the loss of life or fortune, he did not fight the pain. Rather, he accepted its nature as external change, like rain hitting an impervious roof. The purpose of this citadel was not escapism. It was preparation for duty. To be imperious in heart when one's surroundings were nothing but chaos. If your center is solid, then the surrounding turmoil cannot break you. You can withstand the siege because the attack is always aimed at the outer layers, at status, possessions, or comfort, but never at the core reason that sustains you. He understood that the battle for resilience was waged entirely within the self. He trained his attention to dwell only on his own volitional faculty, the part of him responsible for choosing how he would perceive, and therefore how he would feel about events. The empires might rise and fall. Men might amass unimaginable power only to lose it all in an instant, but the capacity for rational choice, that remained sacrosanct. It was the last bastion against fate. This inner space became his final ground of freedom. He realized that by withdrawing his consent, by choosing not to agree with every judgment thrown at him by fortune or by others, he immediately reclaimed his sovereignty. The greatest prison, he understood, was not built by emperor's decree, but by internalized expectation and fear. The inner citadel, therefore, became the ultimate philosophy of action. It taught that true power did not reside in the legions marching under the standards of Rome, nor in the gold stored within the imperial vault. True power resided in the disciplined mind, capable of viewing suffering as transient data points, viewing injustice as a failure of external understanding rather than an assault on his spirit, and choosing acceptance above all else. This mental fortress was impervious to flattery because it valued truth above comfort. It resisted despair because it saw life cycles, birth, growth, decay, quiet rest, as natural laws that demanded disciplined participation. It stood firm against the pull of ambition because its worth was intrinsically defined by virtue alone, not by accolades or earthly reign. In this inner sanctuary, Marcus found not just peace, but a radical form of strength, the strength to operate fully within the turmoil of life, unburdened by the illusion that outer harmony could be achieved. His mission remained duty, but his source of power shifted entirely. He learned that he did not need Rome to grant him dignity. Rather, maintaining the integrity of his own spirit was enough to make him worthy of any empire. The arduous journey to understand the self does not end with grand epiphanies or dramatic reversals of fortune. Instead, it finds its footing in the quiet persistence of routine. After building the inner citadel against the storm, after mastering the space between stimulus and response, the final work of philosophy is the habit of constant, gentle reminders. It requires a deliberate turning inward, shifting from grand concepts to actionable moments. The greatest struggle often lies not with massive external forces, but with the accumulated weight of internal forgetting. We are susceptible to fatigue, to distraction, to the seductive pull of emotional reactivity that whispers among us when we least expect it. The memory of virtue fades faster than a painted wall in the wind, and the gravity of our duty can feel impossibly heavy on any given morning. So, Marcus settles into the steady rhythm of the scribe's desk. Before the weight of imperial command descends, before the immediate crisis demands a swift but potentially flawed response, he begins to write. Not treatises for posterity or political manifestos, but small, deeply personal memos, instructions addressed solely to his future self. These are not pronouncements, they are anchors. The act of recording these thoughts transforms philosophy from an abstract ideal into physical law. It gives the ephemeral weight of ink on parchment. He writes reminders like "remember your purpose," or "the only thing you truly control is this moment." This simple ritual becomes a spiritual lifeline, a pocket guide to resilience placed directly in his own hands. The self-correction memo operates on several levels. First, it acknowledges human fallibility. It accepts that despite all the learning, fatigue will still arrive, and doubt will whisper. Writing these notes is not an admission of weakness, but a highly disciplined acceptance of reality. It is acknowledging, I am complex, I forget, and therefore I must systematically remind myself who I claim to be. The process requires stripping away layers of pretense. When he writes, he does not speak the rhetoric demanded by the Forum or the Senate. He speaks the pure truth that survives rigorous self-interrogation. He reminds himself that success is defined not by victory in battle, but by the quality of his intention and the integrity of his judgment before action. He must guard against what appears to be virtuous behavior, but is merely performance. The impulse to appear strong, thoughtful, or compassionate can become a sophisticated trap. Therefore, he instructs himself to check motivations. Am I acting from duty, or am I acting so that others will approve? Is this discipline for its own sake, or am I simply seeking the applause of my peers? The memo becomes an ethical testing ground. He writes cautions against impatience, recognizing how quickly momentary frustration can erode years of philosophical growth. The great lessons learned, the patience from natural cycles, the acceptance from loss, the detachment from outcome, must be codified and kept readily available. This systematic journaling is a micro-discipline that underpins all others. It transforms wisdom from something merely understood into something actively practiced at every waking moment. It prevents the philosophy of yesterday from becoming irrelevant to the challenges of today. Consider the cumulative effect. Day after day, month after month, these small scriptural reminders build an unbreakable scaffolding around the soul. They are miniature philosophical skirmishes won against internal entropy. He writes that when faced with injustice or profound disappointment, the first step is not anger or lamentation, but a deliberate pause to read the memo and remember that virtue remains independent of circumstance. The emotional journey culminates here. Marcus learns that true resilience is not about achieving a perfect state, nor is it about never feeling pain. Instead, it is about establishing reliable inner habits, routines of thought, that pull him back to center when he drifts toward despair or egoic reaction. The memo is the physical embodiment of this commitment. It teaches him that mastery over self is not a sudden conquest, but an ongoing act of intellectual maintenance. It is accepting that one must constantly police the mind, correcting the course with reason before fate can derail it. By writing these memos, Marcus Aurelius refines his character until he no longer relies solely on willpower, but on institutionalized, internal wisdom. The self-correction memo becomes the final shield, a portable repository of self-definition, always ready to remind him that the emperor's greatest territory is not the border of Rome, but the guarded expanse within his own mind. Throughout the journey of discovery, Marcus learned that wisdom was not a grand revelation, nor a single perfect act. It was instead a relentless commitment to small moments of internal correction. He had transformed the vast philosophical principles into routine practice, turning abstract thought into actionable discipline. The sprawling weight of empire could only be managed by maintaining the meticulous order of the mind. This realization brought him to his final protocol: acceptance. Acceptance, not as passive surrender, but as an active acknowledgement of reality, stripped bare of resistance. It was the recognition that certain events are simply outside the jurisdiction of human will. The river does not stop flowing because we wish it to. The season changes regardless of our desire for it to stay put. And so, too, must his response. The acceptance protocol demanded a profound shift in focus. Where before he struggled against perceived injustice or uncontrollable circumstances, he now trained himself to find stability in the immediate is. To accept is not to consent, but merely to observe the truth of what exists at this precise moment. It requires releasing the emotional energy spent fighting reality's natural flow. This acceptance is not comfortable ease. It is disciplined clarity. It means accepting the unavoidable friction between noble intention and chaotic outcome. It demands that he distinguish sharply between what belongs to him, his own judgments, his virtues, his effort, and what does not belong to him, the whims of men, the severity of fate, the capriciousness of fortune. The training became intensely personal. He began meditating on loss without scenario or pretense. The unexpected betrayal, the sudden ill health of a trusted friend, the capricious decree that undermined months of work, these were the objects of his quiet study. He taught himself to greet these setbacks not with frustration, but with disciplined curiosity. What does this event teach me about my own internal structure? How can I move forward effectively from this new reality? He understood that resistance is itself a form of suffering. To fight an undeniable reality only creates the turmoil it purports to solve. The truly resilient mind, therefore, must become highly skilled at letting go of outcomes, of expectations, and even of his own preferred narrative of how life ought to proceed. He learned to treat unexpected adversity not as a moral failing or a personal attack, but simply as raw data for the practice of existence. The disciplined acceptance allowed him to navigate relationships with greater emotional sobriety. People, even those he admired deeply, remained fundamentally unreliable because they were subject to external influences far beyond their control. He internalized that attachment itself was the source of predictable pain. The wisdom moved him toward a detachment that was not coldness, but profound respect for autonomy. This meant adopting what he termed the protocol. Upon receiving difficult news or facing unchangeable injustice, His first response could never be anger, despair, or frantic striving to reverse time. Instead, there had to be an immediate mental pause, a deliberate cessation of all emotional effort directed toward the past or the imagined future. This pause was not inaction, it was active clarity. The focus shifted entirely to virtuous action in the present. If a situation is unchangeable, if the war is already lost, if the plague has struck the beloved city, if an opponent's malice is absolute, then his power resides only in the next single choice. How will I act justly? How will I speak with dignity? How will I maintain my character under this weight? This disciplined response became his ultimate armor. It proved that external circumstances possess no genuine power over a mind trained to accept its reality, while simultaneously upholding its highest standards of virtue. The chaos outside the lines could never penetrate the stillness he had cultivated within. And so, Marcus Aurelius mastered more than philosophy. He mastered inevitability itself. He learned that life is not a linear ascent toward some final goal of perfection, but rather an endless cycle of accepting what is and choosing how to respond with grace. This acceptance protocol was the ultimate act of resilience, the commitment to move forward, fully engaged in duty, even when everything around him screams for surrender. We stand at the edge of all things, where the sun dips into a vast and unending horizon. The grand theater of human life, so often played out in the blinding glare of ambition and immediate desire, begins to dim. Marcus has walked this winding path toward understanding that true power does not reside in the armies arrayed before him, nor in the edicts carved upon marble pillars. It resides within the quiet chambers of the self. The lessons learned from the ceaseless tides of conflict, from recognizing the inevitable change in every season and the fundamental equality of all human beings, whether emperor or servant, have culminated here, facing the deep, undeniable passage of time. He has mastered acceptance. He knows that struggle is simply life moving forward. But accepting impermanence requires one to confront its ultimate boundary, the end itself. The initial shock of mortality often paralyzes. It compels us to grasp tighter, to reject the truth of decay, because loss feels like a failure of our will. We build monuments against time, hoping permanence can be bought through wealth or glory. But beneath the monumental sweep of history, we are still just awaiting rebirth. Marcus understands this intimately, not merely as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality that casts a subtle shadow over every triumph and every quiet moment. This contemplation of endings is ironically liberating. When one accepts that everything must fade, the empire, the lover's promise, even his own meticulously crafted self-image, the immediate grip of fear slackens. The frantic struggle to hold on to what is presently wonderful becomes exhausting and futile. The greatest resistance we offer is often against the natural rhythm of letting go. To look at the ruins of a forgotten city, or trace the path of smoke dispersing over empty plains, is to witness time in its rawest form. It whispers that every beginning contains the seed of its own end. This recognition strips away pretense. The titles, the ceremonies, the sheer weight of expectation, these are all built on the shifting sands of what might be permanent, and nothing lasts. This truth is profoundly disarming. It doesn't lead to despair. Rather, it initiates a profound recalibration of value. If life is transient, then lasting virtue becomes the only truly reliable possession. The measure of a soul cannot be found in its victories, but in how gracefully it accepts defeat. It cannot be measured by accumulated power, but by the unwavering composure displayed when all foundations crumble. The contemplation shifts from the external, the state of the world, the fate of Rome, to the architecture of the interior self, making the individual mind the final and most fragile fortress to defend against entropy. The end is not just about physical death. It is a continual process of internal decline if reason is neglected. If he had forgotten everything else, the duty, the wisdom, the purpose, and was left only with a handful of years, how would he spend them? That is the true philosophical reckoning. He asks himself to strip away all external supports, considering what single element remains sacred, not his reputation, but his capacity for rational goodness. Mortality provides the ultimate clarifying lens. It forces an exquisite prioritization. Are my concerns worthy of finite breath? Am I spending my moments fighting battles against ghosts of past slights, or am I nourishing the small gardens of present duty and kindness? The urgency imparted by knowing that time is scarce banishes procrastination, not only in action, but in wisdom. He learns that this understanding of endings does not invite despair. Instead, it provides an intense, almost fierce appreciation for the sheer gift of now. The fleeting nature of existence sharpens the focus on virtue, transforming abstract ideals into immediate imperatives. Every breath becomes significant, every choice becomes consequential, because time is demonstrably slipping away. The resilience forged in confronting the end is not the ability to overcome insurmountable odds. It is the quiet, steady power to maintain integrity even when facing undeniable decay. It is realizing that one's value is utterly decoupled from physical continuity or worldly success. The purpose is found simply in how one lived within the span granted, accepting both the brilliance of the dawn and the necessary mystery of the dusk. Thus, Marcus finds his ultimate peace, a deep, resonant tranquility born from recognizing the universal pattern. All things fade, all power diminishes, even memory will soften into dust. But the capacity for rational judgment, once cultivated, remains an echo that outlasts the body, a final defiance against oblivion. This acceptance is not resignation to idleness, but rather a disciplined return of energy to the present moment and the virtuous action required within it. The ending, ultimately, taught him how fully to live, guarding the inner light until the very last breath. The weight of the empire has not vanished simply because I have faced death or acknowledged impermanence. The sheer enormity of my role remains a constant presence, pulling at the edges of my disciplined mind. To lead men, to command armies and govern millions of hearts, is to live perpetually in a state of heightened vigilance. In those early chapters, I learned how to observe the self. I built the citadel within. Yet, when faced with the sprawling reality of governance, even that inner peace feels like merely a shield, insufficient against the torrent of human imperfection. My journey has taught me that true strength is not found in solitary meditation away from the forum, but rather in the messy, unpredictable crucible of public life itself. The theoretical understanding of resilience must now become physical reality, the disciplined act performed while wearing the robes of power. I understand now that my primary opponent is not the barbarian at the gates, nor the treacherous courtier, but the raw, volatile nature of human passion. To rule, therefore, is to manage the emotions of a civilization. The paradox haunts me. How does one reconcile the absolute calm of the philosopher with the ceaseless clamor of command? My training has given me the tools for self-defense. The inner citadel stands firm against my own anxieties. But when I look outward, at the collective stream of human behavior, I see a constant susceptibility to emotional contagion. A single rumor, unchecked anger, or perceived injustice can ripple through an entire populace faster than any messenger on horseback. I realize that the self-correction memos, those small anchors of virtue written in private ink, are insufficient if they cannot be instantly recalled and implemented under fire. Philosophy is not a quiet recitation. It must become reflex, a muscle memory for the soul. It means governing my will with such ruthless constancy that the immediate impulse, the flash of wrath, the sting of pity, the urge to intervene unjustly, is entirely bypassed. The lessons absorbed from watching nature and acknowledging death were profound enough. They taught me detachment from outcome and acceptance of decay. But now I see that this knowledge must be active. It must guide my hands in issuing a decree. It must temper my voice when addressing a subordinate who has failed. And it must steady my gaze when facing the sheer indifference of fate. Leading Rome is not merely about making correct decisions. It is about maintaining a consistent ethical posture in every single moment, regardless of whether I am personally observed. It requires an unwavering dedication to virtue that transcends both praise and blame. The world does not care how philosophical my motives are. It only measures action. I began this path by trying to find peace from the weight. I now realize the highest form of peace is simply performing one's duty perfectly, knowing that perfection is never achieved, but rather approached moment by disciplined moment. It means understanding that the role of an emperor, like the flow of a great river, requires constant adaptation and relentless commitment to its natural course. One cannot simply command the water. One must learn how to move with it. The legacy I seek, then, is not carved into marble, nor recorded in glorious military annals. It resides instead in the integrity of action, in the principled handling of small disputes, in the careful words chosen during a private meeting, and in the steady resilience shown when nothing seems to be going right. The grand gestures are fleeting. The disciplined commitment to being excellent in the minor things is what endures. I must therefore shed the myth of heroic inevitability. I am not meant to single-handedly force cosmic harmony upon a flawed world. My power lies not in achieving perfect outcomes, but in ensuring that my intent and my response are always aligned with reason and compassion. If I cannot change the temperament of Rome, or the malice of its citizens, I can at least control the purity of my own reaction to it. This is the final frontier, making philosophy less an intellectual discipline and more a form of disciplined physical existence. It means accepting that sometimes resilience simply means remaining upright while everything else collapses around you, a quiet witness to chaos, governed only by the relentless rhythm of virtue. The emperor does not conquer the world. He merely strives, day after day, to embody the best